Cuba is marking the 60th anniversary of its cooperation with countries across the world in the field of health. Hundreds of thousands of professionals have been deployed and trained by Cuba. But the US says Cuba is not cooperating in its fight against terrorism. What leads to such strange claims? And finally, people say racism is a legacy of the past, but it's very much alive and kicking, even in the very popular Spanish Football League. Brazilian footballer Vinicius Jr, who plays for Real Madrid, faced racist chants during a match recently. Is fighting racism only hashtags? We ask in today's episode. Welcome to Daily Debrief. The Biden administration has listed Cuba as one of the countries that are not fully cooperating with the United States in its fight against terrorism. Cuba was named among 5 countries that includes Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, and Syria. Responding to the US State Department, Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez called the accusation an abominable crime. Zoe Alexandra, who has more details on this event, will join us now. Welcome to the show, Zoe. The US State Department told the Congress that Cuba and some other countries are not cooperating in fighting terrorism. What does this mean?
So yes, Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State of the Biden administration, made an announcement on the morning of Tuesday, May 23rd, saying that Cuba, North Korea, Iran, Syria, and Venezuela are, quote, not fully cooperating with the United States anti-terrorism efforts. This has many different implications, as many different impacts on not only these countries, but also on the United States as well. On one hand, for example, the countries of Cuba, North Korea, Iran, and Syria, which have already been designated by the State Department as state sponsors of terrorism, this is sort of an informal ratification of that designation. Venezuela is the only country that has not been designated as state sponsor of terrorism. So on one hand, it seems to be a sign that this designation is not going to change, despite many efforts by even Democratic members of Congress in pointing out that this designation has extremely detrimental impacts on the economies of these countries. And so this is definitely a negative development, really, for all of those who fight for peace and who want a world not only where there isn't terrorism, but also a world where people in these countries are able to live freely, are able to live to their fullest potential. We know that actually the designation of state sponsor of terrorism and being designated as a country that does not cooperate with anti-terrorism efforts goes much beyond than just this label. This label actually impacts these countries' abilities to engage in trade, to engage in business with different companies, different entities internationally. It also impacts, for example, if you're living in the United States, your possibility of visiting these countries, what it means to talk about them, what it means to report on them. This is a designation that really has numerous impacts, and most of them are negative.
And if you could also tell us about why was this decision made by the State Department?
So it's hard to say, specifically what was the motivation. What is, for example, the examples they point to. In the past, for example, when Cuba was first put on the state sponsor of terrorism list, it was said that because there was an Interpol alert out on the negotiation team of the peace delegation of the National Liberation Army, which at the time was not engaged with negotiations with the government of Ivan Duque, that because of that, Cuba was harboring terrorists. And we know that actually the reason why this delegation was in Cuba and the reason why Cuba did not extradite this peace delegation is because they were adhering to international treaties, adhering to different international agreements that were signed by partners such as Norway and many other countries that were guarantors in this peace process. And so these kind of excuses are used also, for example, the fact that there are some members of the FBI's most wanted list in Cuba, for example, Sara Shakur, a very famous Black freedom fighter. And these are excuses that the US uses, and sometimes specifically will mention it, sometimes will not even mention it. But these are some of the excuses that are used to justify the fact that Cuba and other countries are not cooperating, and that they, in fact, are even going a step further and actually sponsoring terrorism. And really, I think what at the heart of the matter, we could talk a lot about anti-terrorism efforts undertaken by Iran, by Syria, by Venezuela. We know Syria, had its country almost destroyed by terrorist groups, and it has fought a long, arduous battle that it continues to have impacts of its struggle against terrorist groups till today. So it's clear that it's really not motivated by an actual reason that they're not fighting against terrorism, that they're not trying to combat this. It really seems like this is just a very helpful label that's used by the State Department against their enemies. I mean, what do Cuba, North Korea, Iran, Syria, and Venezuela all have in common? It's sure not what they're doing in terms of, or what they are or aren't doing in terms of anti-terrorism. I think all of those countries are so diverse and having their own different issues that they're dealing with. But I think the main thing that brings them together is that they stand up to U.S. policy, whether that's about extraction of natural resources, whether that's about the social and political model that they have in their countries, whether that's about who owns, as I said, natural resources, who controls them, who benefits from them. That's really what these countries have in common, that they don't follow the diktats of the U.S. State Department. They don't agree with U.S. policy, and they're in many ways enemies of the U.S. because of this, because the U.S. is very used to having complete control over what the world does and says. And as this is slipping away from it, as we're approaching this multipolar world where you see more and more countries actually standing up to the U.S. and its policies, seeing other paths for development, for political advancement, we're seeing that the U.S. is actually cracking down even more, and especially on these countries that are kind of these beacons of sort of radical standing up to the U.S. And of course, they all have their own and very different, very diverse political ideologies that are ruling in these countries. That's not to say that these are all progressive governments. They're extremely diverse, but what they do have in common is that they do not fall in line with the U.S. And of course, this makes them the enemy, and apparently makes them worthy of this label of not supporting U.S. Anti-terrorism efforts, and in most of the cases, actually being state-sponsored of terrorism. So it's a story that we have followed, will continue to follow. And above all, in all of these stories, the main thing that we have to focus on is really the impact on the civilian populations, and what does this mean for these countries' possibility to develop and to have actually an economy, to have politics where people can fully participate and live to their fullest potential.
Thanks for that update, Zoe. And now we move on to our final story of the day. Brazilian football player Vinicius Jr, who plays for Real Madrid, was subjected to racial slurs by spectators during a match with Valencia Football Club. Following the incident, the Spanish police has made 7 arrests so far. However, no other action has been taken. The Brazilian government, led by Lula da Silva, has issued a statement warning against racism and fascism entering football stadiums. Solidarity has also come in from football players from other clubs, but the question of racism in sport remains. Siddhant joins us now in studio for more details on this story. Glad to have you with us in the studio, Siddhant. First off, so similar incidents have happened, but with this incident, Spanish authorities and some figures from Spain have tried to defend the image of the football club, even the incident also. And we, like I said, solidarity has come in from football players from outside the club also. How do we try to understand this event?
I think there are a couple of things here, Shreya. We have to try to understand the event, yes. But we also have to try and separate the event that happened with Vinny Jr. in this case from the wider question that has now become the topic of debate, which is, does racism exist in sport? The short answer to that is, just as racism exists in society, and many commentators have said this in response, it exists in football as well. The idea that somehow, this sport exists on a plane where there is no politics, there is no racial divides, there are no religious divides, and everyone is brought together is a very convenient kind of narrative, whitewashing that is more, I suppose, proposed by the media, by Hollywood, by people making films about how inspiring sport is, and those kind of cliches. Yes, of course, we look at sport as providing many of the tools which enable us to understand other people who come from different cultures, speak different languages, eat different food, perhaps belong to different political ideologies. Yeah, right? Race, of course, is a part of this entire milieu. And sport helps us, particularly team sport, helps us to understand those differences and work and live with each other. What has happened increasingly in football being as popular as it is. First of all, this incident at Valencia that happened with Vinny Jr. is not an isolated incident. This is a regular happenstance in stadiums across Europe. This is Real Madrid and Valencia playing in the Spanish La Liga, which is the top division. So, there are, it's safe to say 30,000 plus cameras in the stadium, because everyone has their mobile phone, plus you have CCTV, plus you have at least 20, 25 broadcast cameras. So the events and all of that can be easily, sort of the chronology can be looked at, and the perpetrators can be clearly identified. This happens in Spain, it happens in Italy, it happens in England. It has happened by, let's say, English fans against English players who happen to be black. We saw it very recently after England's exit from the FIFA World Cup in 2022. It happens in India when a cricket player belonging to a particular community doesn't perform well enough. They are targeted for where they come from, what they believe in, or what they look like. So what is reflected in this incident is, one is, of course, and here what President Lula of Brazil said becomes very important, that we have to fight the fight to not allow this racist and fascist section of football fans to take over the entire atmosphere at our football stadiums, right? Because it is a trend. As political parties that have hard right ideology become more and more popular, as we've seen happening in Europe, they are fighting their politics on the basis of polarizing people. So they bring in conversations of, how the foreigners are coming in and taking your jobs. They are talking about, many people talk about how how football players are these $1 million babies who are highly paid to, let's face it, just kick a ball around, right? So when you go to the stadium, you kind of forget that you are physically interacting with another person. It's almost similar to what you're doing when you're sitting in your living room and watching the game on television, right? All the kind of anger and the rage that is misdirected comes out there. And then what happens, right? I have to say, my heart goes out to Vinny Jr. because there's no reason why anyone should have to go to work and face this kind of abuse, for really no reason from someone who actually has no business doing that. So what authorities need to do is they need to make it clear that the pitch where the game happens is a bubble. In that bubble, rules apply that are football rules, and those are to be taken care of by the football clubs and the football associations. Outside of that, which includes fans and other things, the law of the land still applies.
Right.
So if you are not going to behave like that with a person on the street or someone you know, then there is no reason for you to behave like that with this kid. And we have to remember that Vinny Jr., maybe he's a multi-millionaire, but he's a 22-year-old kid. Faced under his own set of pressures, etc., etc. And in an ideal world, this entire debate should have been resolved at the club level, right? The fan should have said, yes, I made a mistake, I apologize, and I'm willing to take whatever punishment the club has to offer me. But because it is such a widespread issue, such a systemic issue, that comes from actually the time these children are being selected to join football clubs, right? That nothing remains solvable at that level. Everything becomes a mega issue, and it's, I think, extremely heartening that athletes across the board, we've seen it with like the wrestlers who are currently sitting in India's capital, New Delhi, demanding that their allegations of sexual harassment be heard. Similarly, Vinicius Jr. came out with a demand that people take seriously when they say that they are being racially abused, that someone take note of it. And by take note doesn't just mean, now the president of Real Madrid Football Club is an extremely powerful man. For him to pass the buck and say, we have lodged a formal complaint with the federation, is like, I don't know, the richest man in the world going to a mid-level bureaucrat and saying, please sort out my electricity bill. That's not how things work in other sort of situations, and there's no reason why it should here. So beyond doing lip service, I think the people who own these massive football clubs, leagues, etc., need to really show some action, stand behind the players who are the foundation of all of the money that they are all making, right? And say that we stand for you and we will take these concrete steps to protect you. It's not hard to do with all the technology we have at our disposal.
Right. Siddhant, you also talked about how the protection of players is important, but the protocols that are in place are ineffective and not so sufficient. Could you also tell us about the involvement, how the Brazilian government has reacted positively and shown solidarity and some sort of action towards the event?
Yeah. So like I was saying, I mean, what also happens is that I think, other than the fact that these kind of sporting icons are used for their social media reach by political parties, by brands, by all kinds of people to get their message out, when it comes to the needs of these athletes being addressed, often the response is not forthcoming. In India, we talked on this show previously about how a group of most extremely successful wrestlers, many of them who are women Olympic medalists even, are sitting on the streets in protest against allegations of their chief having engaged in sexual harassment and other kinds of workplace harassment. It's been almost a month since they've been on this current agitation, and so far the government hasn't clearly come out and said, we stand by you. This is despite the fact that these kind of right-wing leaders have used any victory that these people achieve in the sporting arena to talk of how somehow, the nation is contributing to them getting to where they are. But when it's their turn to show how governance is also moving on the same track, I think they often fall short. So it's an extremely vital statement that President Lula of Brazil has made, saying that we cannot allow racists and fascists to take over all our spaces. He's of course talking about football stadiums, but it applies to any sort of space where a group of us get together to engage in a common activity, and I think that lies at the sort of core of this entire issue. Until the political narratives and the political discourse doesn't move away from blaming you for stealing what somehow I believe to be my birthright, or somehow you are at fault for everything that is going wrong with my life at the moment. These kind of incidents are bound to take place. So in the short run, I feel like the immediate action being taken by authorities to an extent is a positive outcome of this. And also, if you look at the kind of conversation that is generating, at least online, where these days most conversations seem to happen, 37 million is what the number of followers that Vinicius Jr has just on Instagram. If you add to that all of his colleagues and friends and supporters, millions and millions of people around the world are now talking about this issue. And I think if any long-term solution to racism, not just in sport, but in general, is to be achieved, then that talking about it has to be the first step. And unfortunately, we haven't done that seriously enough. Like you were pointing out, there are hashtags. Yes, kick racism out sounds really good as an idea. But until you figure out how serious you are about kicking racism out, then even things like the all-powerful president of Real Madrid meeting his player and saying, "Oh, we feel bad that you've had to go through this kind of trauma at your workplace," doesn't cut it, because you are capable of doing much more. You are capable of taking much more strong steps to say that we will not stand for this kind of behavior from any fans. Yes, there is no football possible without fans. But also, do we want fans who are treating our players like this, or who think of other people like this in general? So these are all fundamental questions that football needs to ask itself, and a lot more needs to be done by football authorities. And also, we need to stop pretending like this is something that used to happen in the past. Racism is very much an issue of today, and Unfortunately, these circumstances show just how much and how loud you have to shout to just have your voice heard. It's not like you pointed out the first time. 8 or 10 incidents in one season involving the same player means that there is a problem.
Thank you so much for joining us for this story, Siddharth.
Anytime, yeah.
And that's all we have for today. For more such stories, keep watching peoplesdispatch.org. You can also follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter.